How does Nintendo go about naming its consoles? With the grand unveiling of the Switch successor console around the corner, it's time to look into Nintendo's approach to naming their machinery, to look at the different philosophies around branding their technology, and of course to consider where Nintendo may go next. Now, there are many different approaches to naming a major product, and Nintendo has experimented with several over the years. Mainly, a name's job is to be descriptive and to allow people to instantly understand the value of the product and what it does. Sometimes, though, companies go in another direction and try to create a name which doesn't have a pre-existing meaning, but which customers will come to associate uniquely with a particular product. Think Mac or Kindle or indeed Wii. This is a higher risk strategy, as while it can mean that you have a word that enters the lexicon specifically for your product, it's also a risk if people don't quite understand, for example, what a WonderSwan is. Less commonly used by Nintendo, but a strategy often seen elsewhere, is names which represent a particular part of the company's history, most obviously with corporations named after founders such as Ben & Jerry's, but also in evidence, for example, with the way Apple brands its operating systems after places local to its Californian developers, Mojave, Big Sur and so on. Despite Nintendo's close ties with Kyoto, it has yet to really develop names of this sort. Names should also take into account acronym potential, with strong acronyms being something that Nintendo largely achieved from the off with systems like the SNES and the N64, although of course it took until Microsoft launched the Xbox One X to manage a set of initials that were also the console's name. These days, names also require hashtag potential. It always struck me as a big mistake for Nintendo to name 2017's new flagship fighting franchise ARMS, a name which left them scrapping for space on Google search terms and social media hashtags in direct competition with the International Military Industrial Complex, which is probably not a good place to be. Now, Nintendo's choices have changed over time, but generally are quite specific, so let's start by digging back through Nintendo's history because there are certain commonalities in terms of their approaches to names. Early Nintendo consoles tended to focus on names which combined multiple elements, so we can see the Color TV game, the Nintendo Family Computer or Famicom, and its Western equivalent, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Each of these devices has three main elements in their name. Color TV Game indicates three clear propositions, while the addition of Nintendo to the branding of the Famicom or NES was a move to ensure that the brand became associated with video games, although famously Nintendo went a little too far and ultimately had to move to safeguard their trademark because the Nintendo title was becoming such a generic term for a video game that, like Hoover for vacuum cleaner, it risked ceasing to apply to the original device being marketed. The philosophy here seems to be to partner two words which each convey core but different concepts. Entertainment or family both suggest that this is something fun and relaxing, while computer or system also show that it is technological. We also see this with the Game & Watch, which simply and clearly conveyed that the device was both a game and a watch, although the watch was largely an afterthought. With the Game Boy, you can see the naming convention evolve. Instead of family, this is for individual play, so it's a boy, choosing the gender with which their product was most successful. And from the earlier success of the Game & Watch, they borrow the term game. I've not been able to find a confirmation, but it seems very likely that the Game Boy name was an attempt to co-opt the spirit of Sony's incredibly popular Walkman, which achieved staggering success through the 80s. Of course, around this era we also started to see the first sequel consoles, and here the naming convention is again based on complete directness. Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance unambiguously show that they are Game Boys but with specific improvements, while the Super NES similarly tries to differentiate itself from the predecessors by use of an optimistic adjective. This naming convention was originally likely to continue, with the early name of the N64 being the Ultra 64, but this name was ultimately abandoned, probably due to the complexity. For the first time, Nintendo were able to strip back a concept to something so simple it could be shown with their company name and just 2 digits. Nintendo 64. While it might seem like a niche idea these days, in the late 80s and 90s all the talk was about the bits of various consoles, and the decision of Sega and Sony to focus on 32-bit gaming gave an opportunity for Nintendo to tout its power bump over the competition with the N64. Nevertheless, this did suggest that Nintendo were really positioning the console to appeal chiefly to people who already owned video game systems, since the numbers themselves didn't necessarily convey to a broader audience anything particularly about the console. The N64 showed Nintendo that they didn't need to focus on two different elements, but could focus only on one. The Nintendo Double Screen, or DS, followed this philosophy as well. While two words, they picked one individual aspect of the console to showcase. We still see this today with Labo, Alamo, and indeed the Nintendo Switch. With Labo and Alamo, it's clear they have taken English words that convey a core aspect of the product. The idea of a lab like a workshop, and the idea of alarm, and then they have rendered it into Japanese. This includes the requirement to add an O at the end, since Japanese does not have discrete vowels, but appends its vowel sounds to its consonants. Of course, Alamo has in subtitles the Nintendo Sound Clock, although I'm not sure, and perhaps Japanese speakers might be able to comment on whether that's because a sound clock is a more common Japanese term for an alarm clock, or simply whether Nintendo thought the word alarm by itself might be too alarming for the relaxing wake-up they were trying to provide for Alamo users. Similarly, with Labo, they added the Make, Play, Discover slogan as a way to clarify the purpose of the title. Most of Nintendo's modern-day ideas therefore stick to one name, plus, if it's a direct sequel, some additional elements which mark the difference from the predecessor, but there are a couple of strange cases. Firstly, there's GameCube. Evidently realizing that the Game Boy brand appeared to be significantly more resilient than the home console brands had been to this point, they made their first step to unify their game lineup, not just in terms of brand colour, but also in title. I have to say that the choice to name it the GameCube does seem rather odd to me. Clearly they wanted the cube shape to be iconic in its own right and memorable, and perhaps they felt that whereas family and computer both conveyed different values about the product, cube was like boy in Game Boy, a fairly generic placeholder term which would come to be emblematic of the console it was representing. I think it's clear even at this point that Nintendo were starting to shake up their naming conventions, with the code name of Dolphin feeling closer to the more evocative titles of names evidenced by Sega Saturn and Atari Jaguar, neither, to be fair, sales juggernauts. And then of course there is the Wii. Taking the bold choice to weather urine-themed opprobrium, Satoru Iwata chose the word Wii because although it was an original word, it did sum up the values of the console in bringing people together. As Satoru Iwata said at the time, if you look at Nintendo, which has been around for over 100 years, there's always been very much a philosophical approach to what we do, very much a holistic approach to gaming, and we're looking to be all-encompassing for everyone. When we started looking into the name Wii, that's what we were talking about. Everyone, rather than a single thing. It's a very simple word that we've created to come across with that message to everyone. The Wii of course managed what the Mac and the Kindle and other devices have done, which is to create an entirely original name for a concept. The attempt to push this link further with Wii U obviously couldn't quite recapture the same magic, not least because the two concepts of Wii and U are diametrically opposed, and Nintendo didn't really convey what they were doing to make this console both a Wii experience and a U experience. Notably, since the Wii U, they have stuck to almost comically direct names, whereas the DS experimented with spin-offs such as the enigmatically titled DSi, the 3DS line just kept adding adjectives until we got the crazy fun of the new 2DS XL. Meanwhile, the Switch frustrated phonics teachers everywhere by using an incorrect spelling of light, and then followed up with the bracketed OLED model for the OLED version of the Switch. Again, about as ruthlessly direct as you could imagine. This is a jump from the days in 2010 where it seemed unclear whether the tentative name of the 3DS would even stick, which seems mad as it's such a perfect fusion of the DS original while conveying through one mere extra digit, the capability to render titles in the third dimension. I tend to think that they would show less doubt about sticking to this title today. So where does all this leave Nintendo now? Well look, Shuntaro Furukawa has been quite explicit that the next system is positioned as a follow-up to the Switch, so it seems to be at least a 70% likelihood that the system will emulate past naming conventions and be called Switch something. In this case, we have to think what is the most direct way of conveying that it is an evolved Switch. Switch 4K might risk people thinking they can play 4K in handheld, and I don't think they'll want vaguer suffixes which sound like just an iterative tweak on the previous model, like Pro or Plus or even New. Super Switch would certainly work and would have a bit of a callback to Nintendo's history, something they showed they were willing to do with the expansion pack, although of course the expansion pack was aimed very much at its core audience, not the broader audience who would potentially be buying a Super Switch. And then we have simple old Switch 2, which certainly bypasses the risk of another Wii U brand confusion situation, where some people didn't even realise that the U was a sequel console and not just a Wii add-on. That said, the ideal way for Nintendo to frame it would probably be around some new element, given that they always like to surprise and delight and show what they do differently. The rumoured title of Switch Attach makes some sense from this point of view because the additional word conveys some new capacity of the system which moves it beyond just being an iterative sequel console. It feels likely to me that they will have Switch in the title, given that it's a hugely successful brand and they have kept these going previously with the DS, the Game series, the NES series and the Wii lines. But of course, without knowing the detail of the console's air quotes gimmick, how radical they go with naming remains to be seen. All of this does leave open the possibility of a different system with a singular name, but given Nintendo's wish to show continuity with the Switch, I rather doubt we're going to get the Nintendo Go, or what have you. I also think it's unlikely we'll return to the era anytime soon of more obscure and evocative names. Nintendo never really went down the route of calling consoles after animals or planets, and they seem unlikely to start now. And that makes sense for Nintendo. Whereas for something like the Amazon Kindle, the company name Amazon doesn't intrinsically convey a piece of technology, Nintendo is associated with video game systems sufficiently to the point where it no longer requires extra information to be clear to the audience that this is a video game console that is being discussed. If you enjoyed this video, check out my exploration of the colour choices for the console's branding, or some of my other Switch 2 deep dives in the playlist on the screen. You'll probably want to like, subscribe, share, comment and check out the Patreon as well. In the meantime, I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.